So, let's talk about Shrek. Even though Shrek came out in the early 2000s, in 2001 to be specific, it was one of the defining films of that decade. It changed the animated film industry forever, for better or for worse, and it sparked a film franchise that is still culturally relevant to this day. In this video, we're going to be talking about what made Shrek so special and how it changed the animated film industry forever. We have a lot to talk about, so let's dive into it. Up until the 2000s, Disney was really the only animated studio that came to mind when talking about traditionally animated feature-length films. Sure, a bunch of animation studios existed, but none rivaled the cultural or box office success of Disney. Then along came Pixar, which was making waves in animated film tech, specifically with all of their advancements in 3D animation. In 1995, they released the first ever fully 3D animated feature film, Toy Story. The film was a huge success at the box office, earning $393.4 million worldwide on a budget of only $30 million. And it was also a success with critics, sitting at a whopping 96 on Metacritic. But still, even though we had a new animation studio that was pushing the tech used to create amazing stories, they were still working very closely with Disney on their films. It seemed like Disney and Pixar were untouchable in the space of animated films, but then we got DreamWorks Animation. DreamWorks Animation was created as a business subdivision of DreamWorks SKG, and DreamWorks SKG was already a very new studio that was only founded in October of 1994. It was created by some heavy hitters in the film industry: Steven Spielberg, Jeffrey Katzenberg, and David Geffen. The SKG is actually the initials of their last names. DreamWorks Animation's first film was 1998's Ants. It was a movie that came with its own share of controversy because of how Disney and Pixar released A Bug's Life just 1 month after its release. Katzenberg pushed for the creation of Ants because it was a project he pursued during his time at Disney. And to be honest, it almost seemed like a huge FU to Disney by Katzenberg, who had a pretty rocky history with Disney at that point. Both films were in production around the same time, but DreamWorks was able to beat Disney and Pixar to the punch by just 1 month. Unfortunately, the movie didn't do nearly as well as A Bug's Life, bringing in only $171.8 million compared to A Bug's Life's $363.3 million. And Ants both benefited and took a hit from releasing so closely to its Pixar counterpart. Having two very similarly themed films released so closely together, with one coming from a former Disney big rig, was a great story to propel word-of-mouth marketing. But Ants didn't have enough to compete with the better reviewed A Bug's Life, which was also more appealing to children. Either way, it was competing against Pixar and Disney. That same year, in December of 1998, DreamWorks Animation also released a more traditionally animated film with The Prince of Egypt. It didn't do as well with the critics as Ants, but it ended up doing better at the box office, earning $218 million worldwide, which made it the most successful non-Disney animated feature film at that time. And just as a side note, as I've been researching about more and more movies for this channel over time, I'm honestly baffled by how many things Hans Zimmer has been a part of. Just take a look at this man's IMDb. It's crazy. I bring this up because he contributed to The Prince of Egypt's and Ants music. Each time I research, it's like I find out he's part of yet another film I would have never expected. But okay, let's get back on track. So 1998 was a pretty great year for DreamWorks Animation. They were instantly becoming a serious competitor to Disney and even doing a pretty decent job at it, although still falling short. But it wasn't until 2001 where they really came in guns blazing. And as you might have guessed already by the title and intro to the video, it was Shrek that really put them on the map. 2001 was kind of a turning point for animation in general because there were a few films that did really well that year. Monsters Inc., Spirited Away, sort of with Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius, and of course, Shrek. Shrek brought in a whopping $491.8 million at the box office. Sure, Monsters Inc. still beat it out by bringing in $579.7 million, but it wasn't that much more. The difference in their box office was basically offset by their production budgets. The competition was getting heated. Shrek even did better with the critics overall, and Shrek's massive success opened the doors for a lot of other studios to take 3D animated films more seriously. We already had some studios dabbling with them, like Paramount Pictures and Nickelodeon Animation Studio releasing Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius, but Shrek was the first 3D animated film that was getting really taken seriously and was absolutely adored by audiences. After Shrek, there was a huge boom in the number of 3D animated films being released. It wasn't just that studios were taking animation more seriously because it could bring in good money. It was actually being viewed as a more serious medium by the industry in general. And this couldn't be more obvious than the fact that the 2002 Academy Awards for films that came out in 2001 were the first ever to include the category of Best Animated Feature Film. Most people credit DreamWorks and more specifically Shrek as the reason that this category even exists. There was now enough competition and variety to warrant giving out this award. It was also a great excuse for animated films to stay away from the Best Picture category. They could hang out on their own while the quote-unquote real movies could be left alone. While doing research for this video, I learned that when Beauty and the Beast was nominated for the Best Picture award in 1992, it did not go over well with a lot of the Academy members and a lot of people in the film industry. So having more animated films coming out was the perfect way to keep the Best Picture category clean. 3 films were nominated that year for the Best Animated Feature Film Award: Shrek, Monsters Inc., and Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius. Although I'm pretty sure that last one was only there to pad the category a bit. We all know it was between Shrek and Monsters Inc. And Shrek ended up taking home the Oscar. This was a huge slap to the face of Disney, for which Monsters Inc. was produced for by Pixar. At that time, Disney had already been around for almost 80 years and it was the studio most people thought of when it came to animation. And Pixar was the main studio people thought of when it came to 3D animation because of their already impressive catalog of 3D animated films. Then along comes this brand new company with a film that basically subverted all expectations people had when it came to animated films, and they won? Oof, I can imagine a lot of anger that night. This win was validation that DreamWorks should be taken seriously and that animation was no longer just the Disney show. It was also validation for other studios that animated films were a serious form of filmmaking and one that could be critically acclaimed. We've talked about this in some of our previous videos, but there is something called the Oscar effect with regards to film that result in movies getting more money at the box office or doing much better in physical sales if they win an Oscar. And Shrek did amazing in physical sales. So once animated films got their own category, things were getting more serious. But what made Shrek so successful that it resulted in DreamWorks becoming a serious competitor to Disney? Well, first and foremost, it was just different and refreshing. Sure, Pixar films were also different, but Shrek was different in a different way. Pixar films were great for kids and adults because of their underlying message, but Shrek also had a great message for both kids and adults and then took it one step further. It was created in the animated medium, which was traditionally considered to be for children, but it really appealed to an adult's sense of humor, while still appealing to a child's sense of humor. And it's honestly very clever. There are a bunch of jokes and innuendos that go over a child's head but make adults chuckle. Even something as simple as the main antagonist's name was an adult joke that completely went over my head as a kid. Lord Farquaad. What does that sound like when you say it fast? It was also gross. We didn't have a very clean and polished protagonist. Our protagonist was a dirty ogre, living in a swamp, taking mud baths, farting whenever, and using his own earwax as a candle. Today we might not consider this to be anything special, but back then it was very different from the norm. Shrek was also kind of an FU to Disney's traditional formula. Sure, DreamWorks could have taken a very original story and done a bunch of other things that made the film special, but it was a movie that felt very comfortable to us, yet different because it was rooted in fairy tales. And boy oh boy, it flipped everything we've become used to when it came to fairy tales on its head. In traditional fairy tales, we often got some beautiful princess being rescued by some very handsome Prince Charming upon his noble steed to live happily ever after. The prince would have to fight dragons or other monsters just to save the princess, but in Shrek, he kind of was the monster. In this film, the ugly characters are the main ones and the good ones, whereas the pretty characters end up being the bad ones. Even the princess who is considered to be pretty is an ogre at night and even ends up becoming an ogre full time. In later films, the very aptly named Prince Charming is a douche, and not really as good as you'd come to think when you think of a Prince Charming. The noble steed in this film is just a donkey that Shrek finds annoying and doesn't really like until the end of the film. And all the fairy tale references in this film are also familiar enough for us to recognize, but different enough for us to want to pay attention and learn more about. The entire idea is very refreshing. And this is what I mean when I say it's kind of an FU to Disney. Shrek took a premise that is very associated with Disney, the fairy tale, and just flipped it on its head. So get this. Somebody once told me that the world was macaroni. Okay, I'm sorry, I just had to include that, don't at me, but in all seriousness, as we all know, music is an extremely important part of a film. And historically, most animated films used original scores other than a song or two here or there. But again, Shrek turned that on its head. The Shrek soundtrack was so fresh and revolutionary that it was heralded by Variety as a millennial cultural touchstone because of how it opted to use contemporary music instead of original songs. It was even featured on the Billboard Top 200 and got a Grammy nomination. Smash Mouth became synonymous with Shrek. When I hear the first words to the song All Star, I can just see that outhouse door being slammed open. In the 2000s and the decades before, celebrities were a massive draw for audiences. If you slapped a big name on a movie poster, it didn't really matter how good the movie was, you'd get audiences coming to watch it. So it would make sense for animated films to use celebrities as their voice actors and plaster their names all over the marketing material. But that wasn't the case. Before Shrek, for one reason or another, animated movies weren't marketed as heavily by the talent. For Aladdin, even though the massively popular Robin Williams voiced the genie, he made an effort to stay out of the marketing material. Okay, this was because he was trying to promote another movie and didn't want Aladdin to take all of the spotlight. But then there was Toy Story. Tom Hanks and Tim Allen, who were both massive stars at the time, voiced the main characters, but the posters didn't really use their names much. I even watched the original trailers expecting to see and hear their names called out multiple times, but that just wasn't the case. Maybe it's a Disney partnering with Pixar thing, or maybe the fact that it was the first fully 3D animated feature film made it enough of a draw, but my point stands. Then came Shrek, and the actors were used heavily in the marketing material. Just look at these posters. The names are featured prominently, and in one of the posters, they're bigger than the character and the artwork itself. And I get it. Shrek was a massive risk. It was a fairly unknown story that defied what we've come to expect from most animated films from a still fairly new studio that was trying to find its legs. So they needed to stand out and de-risk as much as possible. We've talked about how Aladdin had a huge impact on the film industry in our previous videos because of how it changed the way we think of voice actors. But it was really Shrek that put using big names as the voice actors to the test to see if a studio without much reputation could be successful. Since then, we've seen animated films getting marketed heavily by their voice actors. Despicable Me with Steve Carell, Moana with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, the Super Mario Bros. Movie with Chris Pratt, Kung Fu Panda with Jack Black, the list goes on and on. Yes, we love hearing some of our favorite actors and actresses in animated roles, but Shrek triggered an era where many animated movies were being marketed heavily by the actors voicing them instead of the topic or content of the film itself. But then again, I guess this was already happening with traditional movies for quite a while, so it was just a matter of time before animated films did the same. So what really made Shrek special was that it had a great story, great characters, great animation, but it also went against the grain with so many things we expected at the time when thinking of animated films. And this going against the grain massively influenced the animated film industry. Whether the creators of Shrek knew it at the time or not, they were creating a new formula that would be followed to this day by various other films from many other studios. This was the negative effect that was caused by Shrek. Yes, it opened the door for many more studios, but to compete with Disney and Pixar, most people thought they had to follow the Shrek formula. Studio execs wanted the money that CG films could bring in, but they were under the assumption that they needed to appeal to older audiences. And to do this, they thought they needed to include raunchy pop culture humor. Barnyard, Shark Tale, and even Disney's own Chicken Little, among many others, followed this formula. The era after Shrek was released is considered by some as the darkest age in animation history, where everyone wanted to do what Shrek was doing without really understanding what made it work, just to hopefully make a quick buck. Which brings us to today. It feels like over the past few years, animated films have been getting refreshing all over again. We got the very stylized Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and its sequel. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish was also great and had a unique animation style. Both of these films went against what we've become used to with animation over the past couple of decades, similar to what Shrek did in the early 2000s, and it's awesome to see. It makes me excited about animated films again, and I'm hyped to see what other films come out in the future. I'm just hoping that we don't get a bunch of cheap clones trying to replicate the success of others for a quick buck. But knowing Hollywood's history, it's probably gonna happen. And that's everything. What are your thoughts? What do you think made Shrek special, and do you think it had as big of an impact on the film industry as we claim? Positive or negative? Leave a comment and we'll be sure to join in on the conversation. If you like this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss out on more great content. We also have a Patreon we've linked to in the description if you want to support us further over there. But until next time, have a good one.